In November 1941, I was serving as a mineral officer on the submarine I-24, a submarine launched by the shipyard only 6 months earlier. Beginning in the summer, I had been very busy outfitting and supplying the boat. Tests of the boat, conducted during her maiden voyage from Kuo to Sasebo, yielded only satisfactory results, but on her return to Kure on November 10th, the boat was immediately commissioned into the 3rd Flotilla of the 1st Submarine Squadron, commanded by Captain 2nd Rank Sasaki. An order was soon received to prepare for combat operations. The responsibility for this preparation was assigned to me, although the Type I. Submarines were large. They did not have enough room to receive a 3-month supply of food, so it had to occupy all available spaces and aisles when loading it. Final testing of the boat took a week and required hard work by all personnel. From the Kure naval base, the submarine went to sea with a rather unusual, hangar-like superstructure covering the launching device for ultra-small submarines. The trials were supervised by representatives of the shipyard. On our return to Kure, we had to eliminate a defect found in the main ballast tanks of the boat. We were aware that war was inevitable, and waited with a mixed feeling of impatience and fear for the moment when we would be told of the role we would have to play in it. At a gathering of submarine officers held at the Navy Club on November 17th, the eve of our departure for our first combat mission, the main topic of conversation was the situation in Hawaii. This was the first hint of our destination. We were informed that our ultra-small submarines would be used in an attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet's Pearl Harbor naval base. The idea of using ultra-small submarines originated in 1936, when a submarine officer serving on the naval staff saw an underwater vessel that was used by one man to catch fish. A special ship was built, an ultra-small boat carrier. Intensive testing began in early 1941, and in October of that year, proponents of ultra-small boats proposed plans to use them in an attack on Pearl Harbor in the event of war. The proposals were considered acceptable, provided that an additional plan be made to ensure the return of these boats after the attack and that they not enter the harbor directly. Planning continued in the light of the instructions received. 5 large submarines were equipped with a special device to carry the midget boats. The admiral in command of the submarines submitted the plan in its final version to the commander of the United Fleet for approval. This version of the plan provided, however, for the ultra-small boats to enter the bay, and Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, declared that if they entered the bay they would never return, and that such an entry into the bay was unnecessary. The right to decide this question was left to the boat crews themselves, and as they were all firmly convinced of the possibility of entering the bay, the commander finally agreed and approved the plan. He insisted, however, on working out a detailed plan for organizing the rescue of the boat crews, so that when we received the final order to attack Pearl Harbor, we were instructed to take aboard men if any of them survived the attack. The plan of attack seemed audacious. Given our lack of preparation for this type of attack and our lack of combat experience, we could not help but feel uneasy, even though I had personally participated in combat on the Yangtze River, while serving on gunboats and minesweepers. On November 18th, a detachment of 5 submarines left Kure, carrying on their decks super-small boats, whose crews went almost to certain death in the performance of the task. The route to the Pacific was through the Inland Sea and Bungo Strait. The night was moonless. On leaving the harbour, lights similar to those of a merchant ship were seen on a course parallel to ours. They accompanied us for some time longer, then as the distance increased they disappeared. The boats were proceeding in an underwater position, as it was necessary to conceal the presence of ultra-small submarines on their decks. At dawn the next day, observing the surface through periscope, we determined that we had mistaken our aircraft carrier for a merchant ship during the night. Having discovered the mistake, we surfaced and continued sailing in conjunction with the aircraft carrier. After going out into the open ocean, a 3-shift watch was established. The team, scheduled for battle stations, trained hard. We practiced diving the boat. The squadron commander asked if we were sure of success, to which, as I heard, the commander of our boat replied that he would do his best. At that time, there were only 5 large submarines of the Type I-16 as carriers of ultra-small boats. They constituted the first detachment of boats that were to play a decisive role in the upcoming operation. All the boats were of modern construction, but their crews were newly formed and had not yet had sufficient training, so the question of whether you can count on success was controversial. Dive training was conducted 3 times a day until the crews were sufficiently trained to produce an emergency boat dive. The order for the crossing suggested that all precautions should be observed, as the enemy might use submarine detection equipment, but we knew too little about these equipment. In accordance with our route of travel, we turned eastward and headed for the Hawaiian Islands. The 5 boats of our detachment sailed at 20-mile intervals. 2 detachments of 11 submarines had already left Yokosuka and were proceeding northward in a great circle, intending to pass between the Aleutian Islands and Midway Island. Midway. A 3rd submarine detachment of 9 submarines, which had left the forward base at Kwajalein Island, was hurrying toward Hawaii on a course between Johnston Atoll and Howland Island. Our detachment was proceeding to the Hawaiian Islands, also passing between Johnston Atoll and Howland Island. Howland. It was risky to take this course because of the threat of detection of submarines by enemy sentries, but in view of the delay in equipping the boats, which affected the time of going to sea, there was no other option for choosing a course of passage. We were sailing in a surface position. It was calm, nothing was detected in the air, and on the boundless expanse of the sea. During the daytime on the upper deck there were works connected with the preparation of the ultra-small submarine. Below, the officers were working out attack schemes on maps of the Hawaiian Islands area. Having entered the air patrol area of Is. Wake, we were submerged during the daytime and went in a surface position only at night. The periods of prolonged stay underwater were good from the point of view of training the personnel, but the lack of fresh air and increased temperature caused the men to become lethargic and sleepy. On November 26th, it was reported that there was no hope for a successful conclusion of negotiations with the US. At the same time, we learned that 2 liners and several ships of other classes were anchored at Pearl Harbor. On December 2nd, we learned that hostilities were to begin on December 7th. On the eve of that day, it was reported that there were already 8 liners at Pearl Harbor. At the same time, it was reported that there were no aircraft carriers there, which somewhat disappointed us. Since, however, liners were considered important targets at that time, we were overjoyed at the news. As the time for the commencement of hostilities was approaching, we had to make a final inspection of the torpedoes. This forced us to remove the torpedoes from the torpedo tubes into the boat, which was in an underwater position. This was a dangerous job to do, as the boat was trimmed during the torpedo check. As usual, I was in the central post next to the watch officer to monitor the boat's behavior by instruments. Suddenly the trim increased and the boat went into a dive. The navigator on watch immediately gave the order, blow out the bow ballast tanks. However, this measure, as well as the operation of the tide pumps, did not produce the desired result, and the boat continued to sink. We tried to level the boat by sharply increasing the reverse with a corresponding shifting of the rudders, but this was done too late. I rushed to the torpedo room, where I found that the airline valve for blowing the trim tanks was stuck. No amount of force seemed to be able to move it out of place, and the boat continued to sink. The danger increased as the water pressure increased. The depth gauge arrow began to move faster. Soon the boat could be crushed. Using the fork wrench, I tried again to turn the valve handwheel. Finally it gave way, opening the way for air to enter the tank. We continued to dive for a moment, but soon the downward movement stopped. The depth gauge began to move away from the 90-meter mark, and the boat began to surface. The tidal pump kicked in and the lightened boat quickly came to the surface. The boat was well surprised before submerging again. The normal safe diving depth for boats of this type was considered to be 90 meters, and the limit, i.e., critical, was up to 140 meters, so further diving could prove fatal. It is even unpleasant to remember how close we were from disappearing into the abyss of the Pacific Ocean before the war began. That night when we surfaced, we found that another disaster had befallen us. Due to the great depth of immersion, the torpedo of the ultra-small boat had deformed under the pressure of the water. It was stuck in the torpedo tube, and we had to labor all night to replace it with a spare inside the big boat. This replacement seems easy enough, but it is far from easy. The lack of space on the narrow upper deck made it very difficult to move cargo weighing over 1 ton, not to mention the difficulty in throwing the damaged torpedo overboard, as it had to be done quietly. As we approached the Hawaiian Islands, the weather worsened and the sea swell increased. Preparation of the extra small boat continued every night under very difficult conditions, as the upper deck of our big boat was usually flooded by the wave. We were to approach Pearl Harbor on the evening of December 6th. At last, confirming the skillful work of our navigator, Hawaii appeared on the horizon. As directed, we took position 8 miles from Pearl Harbor. Reports received showed that other submarines had also arrived at the position. By observing measures of stealth, however, we could observe bright lights ashore and the lights of advertisements on Uikiki Beach. Several bright lights on shore we mistook for searchlights. The chains of electric lights at the airfield were clearly visible, and we could hear the sounds of jazz music being broadcast over the radio. It was about 23 hours. 00 min. The enemy was completely unaware of our presence. At the last moment, one of the crew members who were making a final check of the ultra-small boat before launching it reported a gyrocompass malfunction. The appointed time to launch the boat was fast approaching. The malfunction seemed impossible to fix in time. By this time, all other preparations had been completed, and the crew had already taken their places in the boat. The artillery officer of the submarine I-24 had previously visited the Hawaiian Islands. He explained to the commander of the ultra-small boat certain details that should have been kept in mind when entering Pearl Harbor. The appointed time for launching the boat, i.e. 23 HRs, 00 min, had passed, and the gyrocompass still could not be corrected. At 1 HR, 00 min, it was decided to go without the gyrocompass. The commander of the ultra-small boat calmly went up to the bridge to make a final report to our commander and then took his seat in the boat. Our boat loaded, the safety fasteners were given, and the ultra-small boat headed independently for the entrance to Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, at 7 o'clock, 55 min, the air attack on Pearl Harbor began. There was a storm at sea. Excitement was so strong that even a depth of 27 meters we felt the rocking. The roll was up to 5 deg. Starting at 8 o'clock, 25 min. We could hear the faint sounds of explosions coming from Pearl Harbor, but no enemy ships could be seen. Under the influence of rocking, the submarine tended to float up and submerge again. We took all measures to keep her underwater. The pumps worked almost continuously. The boat became heavier and began to sink, depriving us of the opportunity to observe in the periscope, then again surfaced, trying to jump to the surface. Finally, in full daylight, the submarine did surface once. At such a time, the enemy could not be allowed to discover the boat. We quickly filled the equalization tank, taking up to 20 tons of water, but the boat refused to submerge. The commander gave the order, "Hurry up, 2 reconnaissance seaplanes are visible." Eventually, we managed to dive again to a depth of 27 meters, but the rocking did not stop. Then the pump used to trim the boat was found to be malfunctioning, making it impossible to prevent a slight bow trim. Exceedingly uncomfortable, we sincerely hoped that we would not be taken by surprise by the enemy in this condition. I kept glancing at my watch, waiting for sunset, when surfacing was safe. Much later, after our return to Japan, we learned of the interception of an American radiogram, transmitted in plain text, reporting the discovery of an enemy submarine 10 miles south of Cape Barbaro. It was most likely our I-24. However, at that time the enemy was fully engaged in repulsing the air raid, and he apparently had no time to hunt for submarines outside the bay. On that first day of the war, we saw no enemy ships. We were not shelled with artillery or bombed with depth bombs. As darkness fell, following our usual routine, we began to blow out the main ballast tanks in order to surface. Instead of surfacing on an even keel, the boat tilted dangerously to starboard. The blowing of the port side tanks was quickly stopped, but the boat's roll increased. An urgent check showed that the main valve of the cistern was not closed well enough, which was prevented by a piece of wood caught in the valve, which fortunately was easily removed. It had been a month since the boat had been completed, and the debris that had gotten into the boat back at the factory continued to cause a lot of minor annoyances. Everything seemed to have been properly cleaned before going to sea, but something had gotten stuck in the tube, and was now causing us such trouble literally at the enemy's doorstep. As soon as the valve was cleared, we were able to surface and headed full speed for the area intended for the collection of the ultra-small submarines. The sea was calm. The boat approached a position from which we could distinguish the grey outline of the island. Our other submarines were also visible. Reports came to us of the results of the air attacks, but there was no news at all of the super small boats. The 5 big boats were waiting for the return of their little ones, and they still did not return. On the day following the attack, while underwater, we heard explosions like depth charges coming from the entrance to the bay. We believed it was an attack on the submarines of the 3rd Squadron, which were in position there. A whole day passed after the appointed time, but there was still no sign of the little ones. By this time the order came to abandon any idea of rescuing them and return to Kwajalein. The crews of the ultra-small boats, it seemed to us, were going out on a mission with the idea that they would never return. Their personal belongings left behind on the big boats were collected and put in order. Among them were farewell letters to their parents and wills concerning their property and savings. Such preliminary measures justified themselves, as not a single person from the boat crews returned. As commander of the mine torpedo section of the submarine, I was responsible for the super-small boat, but my duties were limited to launching it. I had first seen such a boat at Kure, but had no opportunity to study its construction. We had too little time for that, and the decision to use these boats was taken suddenly. The entrance to Pearl Harbor was closed by anti-submarine nets. About 8 o'clock. On the morning of December 7th, the passage in the net barrier was opened. This allowed the ultra-small boats to penetrate the bay. However, only one of them penetrated the bay and attacked the liner Arizona there. 2 boats were reported missing. A 4th boat was sunk at the entrance to the bay. The 5th boat, as already indicated, was launched late due to a gyrocompass malfunction, which seemed to have been corrected. With great difficulty the boat managed to approach the entrance to the bay, but was detected and attacked by an enemy destroyer squadron using depth bombs. The boat commander made another attempt to enter the bay, but the gyrocompass continued to malfunction, causing the boat to run aground twice. He then tried to follow to the assembly area, and again the boat ran aground, from which he could no longer get off. It proved impossible to fire a torpedo, and the crew, gasping for fresh air, decided to surface, whereupon it was captured by the enemy. The results achieved by our submarines in this operation, compared to the devastation wrought by carrier aviation, were insignificant. At the end of December we arrived at Kwajalein and there celebrated the New Year's Eve reunion. Each of us was in very good spirits on the occasion of the general success achieved at Pearl Harbor. A huge crowd of natives gave us a show with dancing, and the day was spent by all in a carefree manner. The first months of the war were full of incidents unpleasant, extraordinary, and burdensome. In December 1941, the submarine I-169, conducting reconnaissance at the entrance to Pearl Harbor, so tangled in anti-submarine nets that it seemed impossible to get free of them. The boat gave alternately forward and reverse, pumped water out of the tanks and filled them again, but all to no avail. Above the boat passed enemy destroyers which every minute could detect it with their noise detectors. It was impossible to run a fan and freshen the air. The percentage of carbon dioxide inside the boat increased so much that it became difficult to breathe. The crew was in danger of suffocation. In desperation, the commander ordered the boat to go full astern again, and suddenly the boat was free of the net. By this time there was so little oxygen left in the air inside the boat that there was nothing left to do but to surface and take the fight to the destroyer squadrons. The officers and sailors prepared themselves for the worst when the boat surfaced. However, there were no destroyers in the vicinity and it was completely dark. The possibility of the enemy did not disappear, and indeed suddenly again showed the destroyers. The boat urgently submerged and went into deep water. In the underwater position she remained for a long time, but 10 minutes before this stay on the surface was enough to freshen the air. Without detecting us, the destroyers soon withdrew. At that time they were not yet equipped with radar installations, and the boat was saved thanks to a good organization of surveillance. The submarine I-170 did not return after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and after the war we learned that she was attacked by a dive bomber of the type Dauntless, taking off from the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Badly damaged, the boat was unable to dive and was later sunk by another aircraft. On January 3, 1942, the submarine I-24 again left the base in the area of Hawaii. On January 10th, we received a report from another submarine of the sighting of a Lexington-type aircraft carrier. Joining the 2nd Squadron of submarines, we began the pursuit of this aircraft carrier. Having determined by direction finding the course of the aircraft carrier, we continued the pursuit for 2 days, having a surface course of 20 knots. Unfortunately, we again discovered damage to the valve of the emergency dive tank, repaired before in Kwajalein. By our own efforts, we managed to fix the valve for a while, so that the boat could make an emergency dive if necessary. On the afternoon of January 12th, the submarine I-6 unexpectedly detected an enemy aircraft carrier. She dived and attacked it, with 2 torpedoes hitting the target. At the time, we thought the carrier was sunk. In fact, it got away despite the damage it sustained. In any case, this partial success greatly boosted the morale of the crews of all the submarines involved in the pursuit of the aircraft carrier. About a week afterward, we were in position on the enemy's communication routes off the northeastern coast of Hawaii. While underwater at a depth of 27 meters, we suddenly heard successive explosions. We assumed that our boat was being bombed by an airplane and could not understand how the enemy could have detected us. After waiting for some time, the commander raised the periscope, but there were no oil stains that could give us away on the water. The cause of the explosions remained unclear. Probably a reconnaissance airplane, returning after a routine flight, was simply getting rid of bombs before landing. Enemy ships were rarely encountered, and on January 20th it was decided to return to metropolitan waters. On the return trip, as ordered, we made an artillery bombardment of Midway. On the evening of January 22nd, in conjunction with the submarine I-18, we stealthily approached the island. The night was starry, and since the island was very close, the watch intensified surveillance. As we came still closer to the island, we discovered a ship which we mistook for a sentinel, and submerged so as not to be discovered. Shortly afterward, we surfaced again and sighted our Midway, which we succeeded in identifying before dark. At daybreak, the boat submerged again. As we approached the island, we discovered a large merchant vessel anchored. The torpedo apparatuses were put in readiness, but alas, the vessel was behind the reefs, so we had only to wait for the appointed hour for artillery fire. During dinner, a large dispute arose among us as to whether we should open artillery fire at all in case we did not reach the appointed position in time. I was in favor of opening fire, and when we surfaced to commence artillery fire, we still had 5 men to spare. Time. As assistant commander, I was in charge of trimming the boat and was below, so I didn't know what was happening on the surface of the water. After 2 or 3 shots were fired at the boat, the shore batteries returned fire, forcing us to dive urgently. According to the commander's report, we fired on a structure that looked like an airplane hangar, and after our 5th shot there was supposedly a fire on the shore. In fact, it was the flashes from the shore guns, not our hits as we believed. The shells of the first volleys from the shore fell quite close to the bow of the boat, indicating that the firing was undoubtedly from the shore forts. We intended to fire 7 shots, but were forced to submerge, firing only 6 shells. The submarine I-18 was also fired upon by the enemy. She did not fire a single shell, so that our firing was completely fruitless. It would have been better to wait for the anchored vessel to drop anchor and leave the harbour. After travelling in an underwater position for about 4 hours, we surfaced and set a course westward against the oncoming waves of the raging sea. Off the Bonin Islands, we entered a heavy gale. The waves rolled across the foredeck, hitting the bridge's safety glass. I turned in my watch to the navigator and went below to throw off my wet clothes. Suddenly, a broken pane of glass flew down the hatch with a clang and a voice called out for help. I quickly went up to the bridge and saw everyone on the bridge bloodied, including the commander. The wave had shattered the protective windows of the bridge. Shrapnel had injured the men on the bridge. I had to take watch again and give first aid to the injured. Simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the beginning of hostilities off the North American coast were landing on the Philippine Islands and the Malacca Peninsula. 10 submarines of the 4th Squadron under the command of Rear Admiral Ayoshitomi, operating off the Malacca Peninsula, were dispersed in such a way as to prevent any attempts of the British fleet, based in Singapore, to disrupt the landing of Japanese landings and supply them from the sea. Almost all Japanese landings made at dawn on December 7th on the east coast of Malacca were successful, with the exception of the landing in the Kota Baru area. December 7th, our reconnaissance aircraft reported that in Singapore anchored 2 British line ships. The next day at 15 o'clock. 15 min. Submarine I-165 found two large ships in the South China Sea 300 miles north of Singapore. She identified them. They were the battleship Prince of Wales and the line cruiser Ripoll. The ships were on a full course northward to reach the supply lines for our landings. Although the ships were clearly visible, they were out of range of torpedoes. The commander of the submarine I-165, Captain 3rd rank Harada, gave a coded radiogram indicating the bearing of the detected ships and their course. The radiogram was timely received at the headquarters of the forces involved in the Malacca operation. All submarines that were in the area, having received the appropriate instructions, immediately began to pursue the enemy, developing maximum surface running. The grouping of the Japanese fleet in the area of Malacca in the line ships Kongo and Haruna, together with a squadron of cruisers and destroyer squadron under the command of Vice Admiral Nabute Kondo, could not actually resist the grouping of the enemy, but our ships at full speed rushed forward in the hope of forcing the enemy to the night battle, in which they could count on success. During the night, however, contact with the enemy was lost. On December 10th at 3:40 a.m., submarine I-156 detected and attacked the enemy ships travelling south, but due to darkness released torpedoes did not hit the target. At dawn, aviation, inspired by the news of success in Pearl Harbor, also began to search for enemy ships, resulting in bombs dropped from aircraft. 2 enemy ships were sunk. The British Navy was dealt a cruel blow. From that day, the line ships yielded their primacy to aircraft carriers. Although our aviation can rightly be proud of the role it played in this, yet the submarines were the first to report and confirm the location of the 2 ships in question. Hence, the success was the result of the combined action of submarines and aviation. In developing an operational plan, commander of the United Fleet had to decide the main thing first of all. It was necessary to determine with sufficient accuracy the scale of the enemy's combat activity, and it was especially important to identify those of his groupings, which most likely he could oppose the main forces of our fleet. There were various ways of obtaining information on this issue, of which the most reliable and accessible was aerial reconnaissance. Since the range of reconnaissance airplanes was small, special hopes were pinned on aircraft carried by submarines. The size of our submarines gradually increased, with the result that the range of their aircraft also increased. The Japanese command made considerable efforts in the pre-war period to improve this class of submarines. Preliminary tests conducted with an airplane launched from the I-5 submarine led to the adoption of a new submarine, on the deck of which it was possible to install a catapult. By the beginning of the war, 11 submarines were equipped as carriers of special aircraft, including boats I-7, I-8, I-10, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, and I-26. Subsequently, new types of special aircraft carried by submarines were created, and a total of 24 submarine-carrying aircraft were built before the end of the war from I-27 to I-45 and I-54, I-56, I-58, I-11 and I-12. The planes, single-seat hydroplanes, could fly for up to 3 hours at a speed of 165 kilometers per hour. Being very small in size, they were equipped only with a radio station and had no armament, so a meeting with enemy fighters meant certain death for them. Since the time of lifting and fixing the aircraft on the deck took about 1 hour, in some cases when the submarines were in clear danger, it was necessary to abandon the aircraft and escape by urgent diving. Because of the unprotected nature of these planes, they were usually launched before dawn and raised back on deck at sunrise, thus utilizing extremely limited time. Under conditions of bad weather and rough seas, it was difficult for the planes to land on the water, and thus this method of reconnaissance was fraught with many dangers. Nevertheless, thanks to the efforts of experienced commanders and the coolness of the personnel, many valuable reports were quickly transferred to the higher command. Of the pilots who took off in the airplanes from submarines, the most experienced was Ensign Futa. He flew 4,000 hours, and his coolness and courage greatly facilitated the actions of personnel in launching the aircraft from the catapult and lifting it to the deck. Since it was difficult for an airplane to spot such a small object as a submarine when returning from reconnaissance, certain rendezvous points were always points to which both submarine and airplane had to arrive accurately. As a rule, the airplanes would take off near enemy territory, after which the submarine would await the return of the airplane, keeping in continuous radio contact with it. The commander and crew of the submarine were constantly worried that the boat might be suddenly detected by an enemy reconnaissance airplane. If, say, an airplane was expected to return in half an hour, then after it landed on the water it took about another hour to prepare the boat for diving, so that the boat had to stay on the surface of the water for a total of up to 2.5 hours. Sometimes the wings of the airplane were damaged during flight preparation and had to be repaired immediately. During training takeoffs, the engine of the airplane was started after 10 to 15 min. After the boat surfaced, but in conditions of close proximity to the enemy, it was done not earlier than 30 to 60 minutes, during which there was an opportunity to make sure that the submarine was sound. Before the declaration of war, submarines I-10 and I-26 were ordered to conduct reconnaissance off Fiji, Samoa, Tutuila and Aleutian Islands, and to complete it by December 5, 1941. On November 16 and 19, respectively, these boats left Yokosuka and accomplished their assigned tasks without resorting to the use of aircraft. On December 4, the submarine I-10 detected the American cruiser Astoria in the group of Fiji Islands. Nothing else was detected by her. At dawn on December 17, 1941, an airplane from the submarine I-5, flying over Pearl Harbor, made a reconnaissance and delivered valuable information about the damage done to the base and enemy ships by our operational units at the very beginning of the war. In January 1942, an airplane from the submarine I-9, returning from the North American coast to the Kwajalein, also made a reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor. In February 1942, submarine I-25 left Kwajalein and for 2 months conducted reconnaissance off the east coast of Australia and the main ports of New Zealand, achieving considerable success. In early April, the boat returned to Japan. The airplane on her deck flew over Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Wellington, Auckland, Suva and Pago Pago. The commander of the submarine I-17 was ordered to make an aerial reconnaissance of the port of Colombo and Trincomalee base in the Indian Ocean, but since these points were heavily guarded by the enemy, the boat could not fulfill the task. During the fighting near Midway Island and the Aleutian Islands in May 1944, submarines I-25 and I-26 were sent from Yokosuka to conduct aerial reconnaissance of the Kodiak Island area. While in the vicinity of Dutch Harbour, the boat I-25 was preparing to launch an airplane. But at that time an enemy cruiser was sighted. The commander was in a quandary, but decided to send the airplane to reconnoitre, according to plan. The cruiser passed without noticing the boat, but a little later an enemy destroyer squadron appeared. Fortunately, the airplane had already been received by the boat, and she was able to dive to a safe depth. At about the same time, the submarine I-19 was detected by an enemy airplane as the boat's crew was preparing to launch their airplane. The boat was forced to dive urgently, leaving the airplane on the surface of the water. Aerial reconnaissance by aircraft from submarines continued until 1944. But as the activity of enemy patrol aircraft and patrol ships increased, it became more and more dangerous to conduct such reconnaissance. On August 19, 1943, an enemy aircraft attacked and sunk the submarine I-17, which was conducting reconnaissance near the base of Noumea. In August 1942, in response to a raid on Tokyo, American aircraft type B-25 were taken against the American mainland. The plan was to drop incendiary bombs on the Oregon woodlands, using small submarine planes adapted to lift 275 kg incendiary bombs each. On August 15, 1942, the submarine I-25, commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Tagami, left Yokosuka for this purpose with 6 special bombs on board. Following the arc of a great circle, the boat reached the Oregon coast after a 2-week crossing, but because of bad weather and thus the impossibility of launching or taking on deck aircraft, headed south to Cape Blanc, waiting for the weather to improve. One day in mid-September, half an hour before sunrise, when the boat was 6 miles south of the Cape Blanc lighthouse, an airplane piloted by pilot Fujita took off from the boat. 2 bombs were dropped on a wooded area 80 kilometers southeast of the Cape, after which white smoke was observed in the target area. The aircraft returned to the submarine, which waited on the surface of the water for 2 hours. The incendiary bombs dropped were of a special type. They created very high temperatures, effectively hitting the targets. Significant fires were believed to have been created, as American radio reported that there had been human casualties. 2 hours after sunset, the plane made a second sortie. This time the bombs were dropped 16 kilometers west of Cape Blanc. When Fujita returned to the agreed rendezvous point with the boat, he had difficulty locating her. Fortunately, he was able to locate her by an oil trail left on the surface of the water. In late September, there were heavy fogs. Due to a further deterioration of the weather in October, when launching an airplane and getting it on deck became extremely difficult or downright impossible, the above activities were abandoned. In early October, I-25 sank 2 tankers off the west coast of the United States, and with only one remaining torpedo attacked and sank an American submarine. At the end of the month, I-25 returned to domestic waters. Meanwhile, the submarines performed other missions as well. In March 1942, an air raid on Pearl Harbor using flying boats was planned. The commander of submarine I-22 was tasked with selecting a location that could be used as a base to resupply fuel to the flight path. The reef atoll of French frigate proved to be the most suitable for this purpose. The boat also made a preliminary reconnaissance of the area between Hawaii and Midway Island. Midway. In late February, during the period of preparation for the operation, submarines I-15, I-19, I-26 took a supply of aviation gasoline and went to the atoll. Submarine I-9 took up a position between the Marshall Islands and French Frigate Islands and reefs to receive radio reports from the flying boats and transmit them to the hydroaviation base at Jaluit Atoll. The air raid on Pearl Harbor involved large, long-range Type 2 flying boats. On March 4th, at sunset, the flying boats arrived safely from Jaluit Atoll to the French frigate reef area. After refueling the submarines with fuel, the flying boats set a course for the Hawaiian Islands and 7 hours after sunset attacked Pearl Harbor, and then safely returned to the base in Jaluit. On the same day, a naval task force of the enemy attacked Wake Island. Wake, causing the second attack of our flying boats, was postponed until March 5th. However, it was soon cancelled. Submarines were ordered to take up positions in order to intercept the enemy compound on its departure from Wake Island. Wake. In early September 1942, due to a sudden change in the situation in the Solomon Islands, as soon as it became known that the enemy decided to the 17th Army to launch the first general counterattack on Guadalcanal Island, Commander-in-Chief of the United Fleet Admiral Yamamoto attempted to organize a reconnaissance by hydroplanes of the vast area southeast of Guadalcanal Island. Guadalcanal. In mid-September, the submarine I-122 went to this area, which for about a week engaged in refueling flying boats. The latter conducted a wide-front reconnaissance of enemy positions, which gave our forces the opportunity to be ready to repel surprise attacks. During the sea battles in the South Pacific, submarine I-26 conducted reconnaissance in areas south of the Solomon Islands. The boat left its base at Truk Island on October 4th and did not return until November 30th. In the area of the Solomon Islands, the boat for several days made fuel refueling of flying boats operating from the base of hydroaviation, located on Shortland Island. During these operations, the submarine struck a reef, but managed to get off by blowing out the tanks and using reverse, although the 3 lower bow torpedo tubes were disabled in the process. On another occasion, this boat was attacked by an American B-17, but the damage was minor. Despite frequent reconnaissance flights of enemy flying boats in the area of indispensable reefs, the submarine I-127 was able to refuel our flying boats on November 10th. During the retreat from Guadalcanal in January 1943, the flying boats were still able to refuel at indispensable reefs, but by early February the submarines could no longer perform their task because of enemy air attacks. Every day, the American offensive in the area of the Solomon Islands and the east coast of New Guinea Island. New Guinea was intensifying, so most of our submarines were used to disrupt enemy resupply, as well as to supply our isolated forward bases. In mid-August 1943, according to intelligence, it became known that in Hawaii, concentrating and preparing for a new operation of large American forces. To clarify this data, the headquarters of the United Fleet decided to send their submarine I-36. She finished preparations for the campaign and in early September left Yokosuka, arriving at the Hawaiians in mid-September. On September 20th and 27, attempts were made to organize reconnaissance using an airplane launched from the boat, but due to the effective action of American radar stations, the approach of the boat to the islands was difficult. It proved impossible to use an airplane for reconnaissance while far out to sea, so the reconnaissance had to be abandoned. Further attempts to approach Hawaii were also unsuccessful. Finally, in mid-October, the boat commander decided to conduct an aerial reconnaissance when the boat was 300 miles from the islands. This great distance allowed the airplane to fly only one way, toward the object of the reconnaissance. The pilot of the airplane reported by radio that there were 4 line ships, 4 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, and 17 destroyer squadrons at Pearl Harbor. The airplane did not return. The next day, 300 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, submarine I-36 detected a large enemy convoy heading southeast and began its pursuit, reporting it to headquarters. Having received the report of the boat, the commander of the United Fleet immediately sent submarines I-35, I-19, I-175 to the Hawaiian Islands, but soon afterward contact with the enemy convoy was lost. On November 19th, the convoy suddenly appeared off the Gilbert Islands, and the submarines were ordered to concentrate in the area. From the boats of the Special Task Force, returning from the area of the Hawaiian Islands, and several submarines of the latest types, was formed by the 8th Submarine Squadron, which included I-18, I-20, I-20, I-21, I-22, I-24, I-27, I-29 and I-30. The boats of the squadron under the command of Rear Admiral Ishizaki were undergoing training for the second period of special operations. At the end of April 1942, submarines I-10, I-16, I-18, I-20 and I-30 entered the Indian Ocean with a port call at Penang and made a reconnaissance of important areas on the African coast. As a result, it was decided to attack enemy ships in the port of Diego Suarez on May 31st. On the eve of the day of the attack, airplane from the submarine I-10 reported that at anchor in Diego Su.R is anchored line ship type Queen Elizabeth, 1 cruiser and other ships. On the night of 31st May, the ultra-small boats I-16 and I-20 were launched from submarines I-16 and I-20, 10 miles from the harbour entrance. I-18 was unable to launch her boat because of machinery failure. Neither of the 2 launched boats returned from the harbour, although I-16 and I-20 were waiting at the agreed-upon rendezvous point after the attack until June 2nd. It was later determined that the liner Queen Elizabeth had been severely damaged and that the crews of the super-small boats had gone ashore after the attack, engaged in a firefight, and died. Another part of the boats of the 8th Squadron, consisting of I-21, I-22, I-24, I-27 and I-29 under the command of Captain Second Rank Sasaki, operated in the second half of May 1942 in Australian waters. In the port of Sydney anchored line ship, cruiser and other ships, which it was decided to attack. Accordingly, on May 31st at 16 HR30 Min, 7 miles east of Sydney, super-small boats were launched from submarines I-22, I-24 and I-27. Since the 2 aircraft of the larger boats were damaged, the results of the attack could not be determined, and it was not until after the war that it was learned that 1 torpedo fired by an ultra-small boat passed astern of the cruiser and exploded between it and the pier, damaging the boat and causing minor damage to the cruiser, while the results of the attack by the other boats remained unknown. Although the results of the attack were insignificant, the mere fact that enemy ships were suddenly attacked in the harbour of Sydney, Australia's largest city, had a great moral effect. In later years, when the war took a bad turn for us, the bravery shown by those who died in the Sydney attack was an inspiring example to those who volunteered for these special units. In view of the increased activity of the enemy's guard ships in the area of the Lunga anchorage, it was decided to attack the ships stationed there with ultra-small boats, which would be carried by a troop of submarines consisting of I-16, I-20, I-24 under the command of Captain Second Rank N. Star. It was planned that the big boats would take the super-small ones in the vicinity of Truk Islands or Far Shortland past to the northern entrance to Indispensable Strait, where they would launch them. After the attack, the ultra-small boats were to proceed to Marovo Point, located at the northern tip of Guadalcanal Island. Guadalcanal, where the crews were to go ashore, having previously sunk their boats. On November 15, 1942, submarines I-16 and I-20 made an attack, sinking a transport and a destroyer, but only 1 ultra-small boat returned after the attack. The boats I-6 and I-20 for the period from mid-November to mid-December made 2 attacks each, using ultra-small boats, sinking a total of 4 transports and 1 destroyer. 1 super-small boat failed to fire a torpedo as a result of a breakdown. Half of the super-small boats that attacked the enemy ships did not return, in order to defend the island of Mindanao. Mindanao and to cover the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits, 8 ultra-small boats were stationed in the Philippine area, of which 4 were stationed at Cebu, 2 at Zamboanga, and 2 at Davao. As the enemy's invasion of the Philippine Islands progressed, vessel traffic increased in the Sulu Sea from Mindanao to other islands, so the area of attack was chosen a narrow part of the Sulu Sea between the southern tip of Negros Island and the northern tip of Davao Island. Negros Island and the northern tip of Mindanao Island, Mindanao. The boats were in Duma Gate in readiness for departure and were to leave on signal from an observation post established on the coast of Surigao Strait. From December 8, 1944 to March 21, 1945, these submarines sank 14 enemy ships and vessels, including 2 cruisers, 1 aircraft carrier, 5 destroyers and 5 transports. On March 20, 1945, American troops landed in Davao, so further use of this base was impossible for us. The crews of the ultra-small boats sank the boats themselves and went ashore to take part in the fighting of the land units. Our submarines were usually armed with guns of 80 to 140 mm caliber, designed either for strafing or for firing at a high angle of elevation. There were also twin 25 mm machine guns for engaging air targets. In most countries it was believed that such armament was effective enough to engage unarmed merchant ships and to fire on coastal targets not protected by shore batteries. The armament of submarines was never designed to withstand the armament of surface ships or shore batteries. The submarine crew, which could take more than 1 minute after surfacing to open an artillery barrage, was always concerned that the enemy might be the first to open accurate fire on the boat. Moreover, our submarines had rangefinders mainly of the portable type and therefore inaccurate. As a consequence, our firing methods were too primitive and it took a long time to hit the target. Up to 20 shells were stored in cranes on the upper deck, and if more shells were required, they had to be fed from the artillery cellar. This order created certain difficulties and increased the time when it was necessary to make an urgent submergence of the submarine, because the cover of the shell-feeding pipe could not be firmly sealed from inside the boat. It was impossible to prevent the entry of water into the boat when the cover remained loose. Given these circumstances, our submarines used artillery only as a last resort. As a rule, the gunner on a submarine was a young officer with the rank of junior lieutenant. Boats armed with guns that could be fired at a high angle of elevation, unless they had modern fire control devices, were able to hit airplanes purely by accident. As an artillery officer myself, I tried many times to shoot down an airplane with a gun, but I never succeeded, because the distance to the airplane was determined by eye and firing at random. Radar allows you to determine the exact distance to the target, but our submarines, even by the end of the war, were not yet equipped with radar gunnery stations. During World War II, there were few instances of submarines engaging aircraft. Any submarine that detected an airplane would only engage it if it was unable to submerge. There was a case in 1944, when the submarine I-44, pursued by an enemy flying boat in the area of the Admiralty Islands, decided to stay in a surface position and fire at the aircraft from a gun with a low angle of elevation. Fortunately, she was then able to return safely to base. From the beginning of the war until January 1943, most of the submarines that shelled various objects in enemy territory managed to get away under the cover of darkness and avoid enemy attacks. The target range of firing was determined by map. Given the inevitability of errors, the accuracy of the hit was very doubtful. Therefore, it was useless to fire at targets of small size, and firing was usually done in the square in order to demoralize the population. Orders to shell enemy targets were received by submarine commanders without desire, although unsophisticated people could regard these actions, i.e., shelling, as feats. An enemy counterattack could decide the fate of the boat, since a single hit was enough to deprive the boat of the ability to submerge. The boat could, of course, going underwater in areas where attack by surface ships was ruled out, stealthily approaching the target. Although the artillery bombardment may not have caused a big fuss at first, but to repeat such actions in the same area would be unwise, therefore success could only ensure the accuracy of firing and luck. On occasion, submarine shelling of the shore did succeed in setting fire to military barracks and destroying important enemy installations. The bombardment of Johnston Atoll by submarines I-22 and I-16 on December 16, 1941, was the first example of this type of warfare. The named island is about 900 meters long and 220 meters wide, and has a mountainous coastline. There are few suitable areas on the island to set up bases for flying boats. When the boat I-22 approached the island, it was quite difficult for her to determine her exact position due to thick cloud cover. Only from a distance of 900 meters did she find the island, which she fired upon after sunset. The submarine I-16 failed to find the island. Another time the same island was shelled by submarine I-68, which was part of the 3rd Boat Squadron. At the end of December 1941, one boat from the same squadron shelled the island of Palmyra. In doing so she ran aground, but was able to dismount without damage and leave. At about the same time, the islands of Hawaii, Maui, and Kauai were shelled by submarines of the 2nd Squadron. On December 10 and 11, 1941, the obsolete submarines Row 13, Row 64, and Row 68, armed with 80 mm guns, shelled enemy flying boat base installations on Howland and Baker Islands in the Central Pacific. In early 1942, they shelled the U.S. coast with artillery. In the second half of January 1942, submarines I-24 and I-18 were ordered to bombard the island of Midway. But only submarine I-24 accomplished the task. In early February, submarine I-169, having finished patrolling the area off Midway Island, shelled military installations on Sand Island. In June 1942, the island was again shelled, this time by submarine I-168. On February 24, 1942, the submarine I-17 penetrated the Santa Barbara Strait, north of Los Angeles, and surfacing 5 minutes before sunset, made the first shelling of the American coast. Signs of panic were observed on shore and air raid alarms were sounded. After firing 10 shots, the I-17 began to leave at full surface speed. On the way out, an enemy destroyer was detected, which rushed to the scene, but the boat managed to slip away undetected. In late June, the submarine I-26 shelled the Naval Navigation radio station on Vancouver Island. The enemy radioed an SOS distress signal, extinguished the beacon's fire, and experiencing great confusion, blacked out the station area. The boat fired 17 shells, but the damage done ashore was minor. The submarine I-25 was tasked with shelling the American submarine base at Astoria. She approached the coast in an underwater position, then surfaced in the moonlight, finding herself in the middle of small fishing vessels. The boat urgently dived for fear of being discovered. The next day she approached the coast again and surfaced. The night was clear, moonlit, and this time no vessels were in the vicinity. 20 shots were fired at shore objects, causing great confusion. Again the siren sounds were heard. Although the damage done to the enemy by these submarine bombardments may have been slight, still these actions were carried on throughout the year. In March, an I-4 submarine shelled the island of Cocos. In January 1943, during our retreat from Guadalcanal Island, Cocos Island was again shelled. Cocos was again shelled by the submarine I-166. At the same time, submarine I-165 shelled the port of Gregory, located on the west coast of Australia north of Girard. During the retreat from Guadalcanal Island, in order to divert the attention of the enemy connection of ships consisting of the cruiser Nara, destroyer and submarine I-8 subjected to artillery fire at Canton Atoll. On August 31st, submarine I-19 shelled the American hydroaviation base in Graziosa Bay, causing some damage, and on September 8th, submarine I-31 boldly entered the bay, which also shelled the base, causing significant damage. In mid-October 1942, the submarine I-7 shelled the airfield on Espiritu Santo Island. Later, the same submarine shelled the airfield again, causing damage that significantly reduced the activity of the airfield-based Everett-based aircraft just during the general enemy offensive on Guadalcanal Island. Artillery fire was also directed at facilities on the Australian coast. On June 7 and 8, the submarine I-21 shelled a steel mill and shipyards in Newcastle. The submarine I-24 approached the port of Sydney and after releasing the ultra-small boats surfaced and then fired over 10 rounds at the city from a distance of about 6 miles. Prior to the firing, the lights of the city were brightly reflected in the sky. After the first shot was fired, the lights suddenly went out, and at the same time searchlights flashed over the bay, clearly illuminating the submarine, but it managed to submerge and escape. Submarines sometimes used their artillery in sinking merchant ships already damaged by torpedoes. The use of artillery was desirable in order to save torpedoes, but it resulted in a large consumption of artillery shells and increased the submarine's time in a surface position, which was dangerous in areas where enemy forces could always appear. This method of sinking merchant ships was comparatively slow. They sometimes seemed truly unsinkable. In June 1942, during daylight hours, the submarine I-21, while in the area of Noumea, surfaced and fired on a merchant ship, the crew of which boarded the boats and left it. The I-21 fired at least 60 shots, but the vessel did not sink. When it was examined at close range, it was found that all the holes in the hull were above the waterline. A similar case occurred in May when the submarine I-26 in the vicinity of Dutch Harbour tried to sink an enemy merchant ship in this way. The gun became very hot from firing, but the ship continued to stay afloat. Having fired 50 shells without result, the boat commander sank it with a torpedo. It was especially difficult to sink tankers. According to reports from submarine commanders operating at the beginning of the war off the west coast of America, tankers, no matter how many torpedoes fired at them, did not sink. They lost speed, but remained afloat. There was a case where a submarine fired 6 torpedoes in succession, seeing one torpedo hit after another, but the tanker continued to stay afloat. The boat then surfaced and opened artillery fire, but was itself shelled from the tanker and had to withdraw. It was generally believed that no tanker could be destroyed unless both torpedo and artillery weapons were used against it. During World War I, Germany had a policy of sinking merchant ships without warning in an effort to force the Allies, especially England, to surrender. This was unrestricted submarine warfare. After much research into the matter, Germany decided to follow the same policy in World War II, which, as in World War I, was not successful and ended in failure. The United States followed the same tactics in the war against Japan and achieved great success by directing the main effort of submarines against the sea lanes of communication. Japanese policy was to use submarines primarily for the purpose of destroying American naval forces. Actions to disrupt sea lines of communication were given secondary importance by the Japanese. The main objects of attack were considered aircraft carriers, then line and other naval vessels. It was allowed to attack merchant ships only when there were no noteworthy warships. Throughout the war, actions to disrupt sea lines of communication were carried out only when it was possible to allocate submarines for this purpose, without weakening the combat composition of the fleet. December 10, 1941, from the commander of the submarine I-6, located in the Kauai Strait southeast of Pearl Harbor, received a report that 2 American cruisers and aircraft carrier type Lexington following a course to the northeast. Admiral in command of the 6th Fleet, based at Kwajalein, immediately ordered to pursue the enemy submarines of the 1st Squadron, consisting of I-9, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, I-25. The listed boats were at that time in the area north of Oahu. In addition, submarines I-10 and I-26 were ordered to prepare to meet the enemy. These boats were in position on the sea lanes between Hawaii and the American continent and had the task of intercepting the enemy aircraft carrier, but they failed to detect it. The pursuit continued almost to the coast of America. When it became clear that the prey slipped away, the named submarines were ordered to begin actions to disrupt maritime communications in the area. By this time, the grouping included the submarines I-9, I-10, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, I-25, and I-26, which occupied positions along the U.S. coast from Seattle in the north to Los Angeles in the south. These were the newest submarines with a surface displacement of about 2,000 tons. With a surface speed of 24 knots, the boats carried 1 aircraft each on their decks. Submarines I-9 and I-10 had a larger displacement. The boats continued combat operations against merchant ships in the second half of December, but by the end of the month there was a significant strengthening of anti-submarine protection of American transports. About 100 tankers and cargo ships were sunk during this period. Submarine I-26 went to the area of combat operations immediately after its refitting and almost did not pass the program envisaged by the long sea trials, as a result of which the operation of some mechanisms had malfunctions. The beginning of the war found this boat in position between Hawaii and San Francisco. In the morning of December 8, 1941, the boat I-26 fired a gun and sank a military transport with a displacement of 3,000 tons, thus opening the combat account of Japanese submarines in the war. She then proceeded to the Vancouver area, where she attacked a merchant ship by firing a torpedo at it, but the attack was unsuccessful. In accordance with pre-war combat manuals, the number of torpedoes that were allowed to be fired at various targets was strictly limited on merchant ships and destroyers 1 torpedo, on cruisers 3, on line ships and aircraft carriers if possible, all available torpedoes. This greatly reduced the probability of hitting a merchant ship, since the accuracy of torpedo fire is much less than that of gunfire. Various tests showed that a torpedo hit could be expected when the distance to the target did not exceed 750 meters at greater distances. Hitting the target with a single torpedo was unlikely. On or about December 27th, the submarine I-25, commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Tagami, approached within 10 miles of the mouth of the Columbia River. Using the darkness and rainy weather, the boat surfaced and, finding the transport Connecticut displacement of 20,000 tons, attacked it. Released torpedo hit the target, but it seemed that the ship will not sink, and the commander of the boat was about to release a second torpedo, but it began to sink. The crew lowered the lifeboats and, according to an American radio report, made it safely ashore. The submarine I-23, under the command of Captain 3rd Rank Nasid, while in a surface position, shelled an old gunboat that was trying to escape pursuit by heading into Monterey Bay. One of the shells damaged the gunboat's rudder, causing it to begin to describe a curve and then run aground. After firing several more shells at the enemy ship, the submarine withdrew into the sea. At the end of December, the Japanese boats left the American coast and in mid-January arrived at their base at Kwajalein. On the way there, in the area between Johnston Atoll and the Marshall Islands, submarine I-25 Pepelengo a number of enemy radio stations and changed course, following the direction of the signals. Before sunset on January 8th, Lieutenant Junior Lieutenant Takahashi, who was on watch, reported, "I see an island." Further observation showed that it was not an island, but a warship. The boat immediately submerged, and the commander began to approach the target with all torpedo tubes at the ready. Observation through the periscope showed that it was an aircraft carrier. The lifting booms and the ship's flight deck with 5 airplanes lined up on it could be seen. The aircraft carrier stalled, and after getting close enough the submarine could get a good look at it. A salvo of 4 torpedoes followed, all of them hitting the target. In late January, the submarine I-8 went out to act to disrupt enemy sea communications and in early February arrived in the area of San Francisco. She cruised off the coast, reaching as far north as the port of Seattle, but without encountering any enemy vessels, she returned to Japan in early March. The submarine I-17, together with another boat, went out to search for the enemy's operational compound, which attacked the anchorage of Kwajalein Atoll on February 2nd, but the boat failed to detect the enemy and headed for the west coast of North America, arriving in the area of San Diego on February 20th. After the already described by us artillery bombardment of the city of Santa Barbara, I-17 sank in the area of San Francisco torpedo merchant ship, but surfaced after the attack, itself was subjected to artillery fire. Probably the enemy had already had time to arm their merchant ships. Submarine I-6 also sank 1 American merchant ship. At the end of March, she returned to domestic waters. After that, actions to disrupt maritime communications off the American coast were temporarily stopped, although in early October 1942, submarine I-25, returning from a mission to drop incendiary bombs over the woodlands of Oregon, made in the northern part of the American coast several attacks on enemy ships, sinking 2 tankers. While continuing to search for the enemy, the boat herself was attacked by American bombers at a disadvantageous moment for the boat, when her entire crew, including the personnel of the electromechanical unit, were on the upper deck. At the time when the boat was submerged only to a depth of 6 meters, the bombs fell. Fortunately, the explosions damaged only the antenna device, which caused a leak in the boat's hull. Despite being left without radio communications, the boat continued on her mission. North of Seattle, she detected 2 U.S. submarines traveling on a course to the southeast. Submarine I-25 had only 1 torpedo left. Closing to a distance of 450 meters, the boat commander fired at the target. The torpedo hit one of the American boats. A violent explosion ensued and the American boat sank. At the end of May 1942, preparing for operations in the area of the Aleutian Islands and Island. Midway, submarines I-25 and I-26 headed along the Aleutians to the Seattle area. While in position off Vancouver Strait, they sank one American transport. During 1943, all submarine formations fought in the Solomon Islands area. Noteworthy action in the vicinity of the American coast during this period. Some results in this area were achieved at the end of 1944, when the submarine I-12 sunk 2 enemy ships. But since February 1945, information from this boat stopped coming and its fate was unknown. Thus, submarine warfare off the American coast, despite their limited scope, was not unsuccessful. The Indian Ocean was also the operational area of Japanese submarines. After we took possession of the port of Penang on the Malacca Peninsula, our boats, not waiting for the fall of Singapore, in January 1942, were sent to the Indian Ocean, where they began actions to disrupt enemy sea communications. Until 1944, cases of escorting enemy ships in convoys in this area were still quite rare. Attacks on individual transports by our submarines were carried out all the time, despite the fact the number of boats involved in hostilities there, depending on the situation, constantly changed. Although, under the terms of our agreement with Germany, the boundaries of the German and our submarine areas were somewhat displaced, the area reserved for Japanese submarine operations usually extended from the Arabian Sea to South Africa and covered the entire Indian Ocean. Our submarines suffered minor losses there, and their successes were great, while in the Pacific Ocean it was just the opposite. Therefore, all submarine commanders preferred to fight in the Indian Ocean. I must confess that I too wanted to fight in that area, but unfortunately my dream was not realized. Penang port was better equipped in every way compared to the bases in the South Seas. The conditions under which the boats fought in the Indian Ocean were considered by the boat crews as paradise compared to the bloody difficult war in the Pacific. Sinking unguarded merchant ships was not difficult. The most daring submarine commanders would surface, approach the transports, and set them on fire using gasoline, thus saving shells and torpedoes. Most of these commanders subsequently perished in the Pacific. Appendix B lists 80 ships sunk in the Indian Ocean, with only 2 boats lost on our side, the I-160 and the I-34. The former was sunk in the Strait of Zondo by a British destroyer, and the latter by a British submarine at the exit from the port of Penang, when she was on her way to Japan in November 1943. The most successful were the actions of the boats of the 8th Squadron in the Straits of Mozambique. They continued with an interval of over 3 months. In early August 1942, all boats returned safely to Penang. Along with the boats went out raiders Hokoku Maru and Ikoku Maru, armed with torpedo tubes. They supplied the submarines with fuel and at the same time engaged in hostilities themselves, sinking one vessel and capturing a second as a trophy. Actions to disrupt maritime communications in the Indian Ocean, despite the deteriorating situation in the Pacific Ocean, continued in 1944. But the enemy has already widely used the conduct of ships in convoys. The number of submarines that could be allocated to this area gradually decreased, and our losses began to grow. On February 11, 1944, the submarine Row 110 was lost in battle with an enemy gunboat in the Visakhapatnam area, and in the same month the submarine I-27 went missing. In September 1944, the boats I-8, I-37, I-165, Row 113, and Row 115 operated in the Indian Ocean, but were gradually withdrawn to the Pacific at the end of the year, where all were lost over the next 6 months. The submarine I-6 made in the vicinity of the port of Brisbane successful placement of magnetic mines through torpedo tubes. Submarines I-121, I-122, I-123, and I-124 were specially equipped for mine laying. In addition to the bow torpedo tubes, the stern of the boat was used for the same purpose. The surface displacement of these boats was 1,140 tons, with a surface speed of 14 knots. In 1940, gasoline tanks were installed on the upper deck of each of these boats, which allowed the boats to be used for an additional task, refueling aircraft with fuel. The peculiarity of the design of these boats made it very difficult to control them. Their over-water course was small. They were poorly controlled in the underwater position because of the small size of horizontal and vertical rudders. A small change in weight fore or aft caused the boat to trim. At the slightest decrease in weight, the boat tended to float, and at the slightest overload, the boat tended to sink. Because of these negative qualities, the boat earned a bad reputation among submariners. In 1940, I served as an officer miner on one of these boats. Having dropped the mines, it was necessary to take water in the substitute tank of the boat in the amount compensating the weight of mines, otherwise the stern of the boat could jump to the surface. If a little more water was taken, the boat would sink. To move one after another 48 mines to the stern of the boat, taking at the same time water into the bow tanks in order to surprise the boat, was truly dangerous work. As a result of improper actions of the personnel, there were accidents, including fatalities, caused by the sudden movement of mines as a result of poor trim of the boat. Personally, fortunately, I avoided responsibility for such mishaps thanks to the experience of our helmsman, who had served on submarines for 6 years. It was extremely difficult to keep the boat on an even keel at a given depth and at the same time accurately place mines. It was usually required that the mines at the entrances to bays be laid at a tidal current speed of 2 knots. In order to avoid any dangerous mistakes, required exceptional coordination of the boat commander and navigator. Concentrated before the beginning of the war on Hainan Island, the connection of submarine barriers left the base on December 1, 1941. On December 8, submarines I-123 and I-124 covertly placed 40 mines at the western entrance to Balabac Strait and at the port of Manila, respectively. After accomplishing this task, submarine I-124 picked up at sea the crews of airplanes that had crashed during air raids on Manila and also reported weather conditions. On December 10th, submarines I-121 and I-122 laid mines in the Singapore Strait and sank a merchant ship attempting to leave the area. Later, submarine I-123 laid mines at the northern entrance to Surabaya Strait, and submarine I-121 came to Manila Bay a second time, but being detected by enemy sentries, was unable to lay mines. In June 1942, after our defeat at Midway Island, in order to weaken the offensive impulse of the enemy and to raise the morale of the Japanese armed forces, were planned on a large-scale actions to disrupt maritime communications in the Indian Ocean and in the area of Australia. However, this plan could not be realized, because the enemy at that time began a counter-offensive in the Solomon Islands, and in order to counteract it, most of our boats had to be concentrated in this area. Nevertheless, a small force continued to operate in the Indian Ocean and in Australian waters. The 8th Submarine Squadron completed these actions by attacking super-small boats of enemy ships in the ports of Diego Suarez and Sydney. In mid-June, following the Battle of Midway Island, the 3rd Submarine Squadron also began operations to disrupt maritime communications in Australian waters. Submarine I-24 attacked at night a merchant ship near Sydney, but due to the premature explosion of a torpedo attack ended in vain, and, having developed maximum speed, the ship began to leave. The boat commander gave the order to surface and open artillery fire, but without a searchlight in the darkness it was difficult to shoot accurately. Eventually one shell hit the target, the boat stopped and its crew began to disembark in dinghies. The boat commander could have killed the victim with a torpedo, but abandoned the idea because a signal was intercepted from the doomed vessel that it was under attack by a submarine and asking for help. There were other cases of premature explosion of torpedoes, which was due to the hypersensitivity of the fuses. This shortcoming was subsequently eliminated. After our retreat from Guadalcanal Island, the guarding of enemy transports became more effective, and the losses of our submarines increased. The reason for this was partly due to the enemy's development of means of warning of danger, as well as his gaining air supremacy as the strength of our carrier formations decreased. Moreover, enemy transports began to sail off the northeastern coast of Australia, covered by the Great Barrier Reef, where anti-submarine surveillance was particularly strong, so the success of boats to disrupt maritime communications leading from the rear to Guadalcanal Island and the area of New Guinea were insignificant, although it was said at the time that the enemy aircraft remained at airfields in Australia without fuel. In general, the situation seemed to begin to develop not in our favour. Headquarters of the 6th Fleet, located in the submarine base on Truk Island, more and more seriously looked at events. Since the vast territories separating Japan and Germany were considered enemy, the only means of communication between the two countries were submarines using the sea route through the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope to the Atlantic Ocean and further to the ports of German-occupied France. This route of more than 15,000 miles was used by the squadron of the Russian Baltic Fleet during the Russo-Japanese War. It is associated with great difficulties, with constant anxiety. The danger was posed not only by submarines, aviation and enemy guard ships, but also by the route itself, which passed through the strip of roaring 40s latitudes, through areas with changeable weather. The difficulties experienced by the boats in cold weather were almost unbearable. It is not surprising, therefore, that of the 5 Japanese boats that went to Germany, only one returned back without incident. A few German boats came to Singapore and directly to Japan. Admiral Nomura returned to Japan on a German submarine. A number of Japanese Army liaison officers reached Germany on submarines, but few of them managed to return home safely. In any case, going on the return trip, they all left wills before leaving Berlin. One of the first to go to Germany was the submarine I-30. After taking part in an attack by super-small boats on British ships in the port of Diego Suarez, she replenished fuel and food supplies from the raiders Hoku Maru and Ikoku Maru, left these ships and headed independently in the Atlantic around the Cape of Good Hope. It was early July, a time of exceptionally strong storms in the band of roaring 40s latitudes, but the boat managed to safely pass them and on August 2nd entered the Bay of Biscay. 3 days later she was met by German minesweepers, and the same day arrived in the port of Lorient, where the delivered cargoes were handed over. The commander of the boat was awarded a German medal. Then, taking a new cargo, the boat I-30 headed back and arrived in Singapore in October 1942. On leaving Singapore, however, she struck a British mine and sank. Most of her crew was saved, but much valuable cargo was lost. At the end of June 1943, another submarine I-8 finished preparations for a long campaign. She was to deliver to Brest the crew for the submarine Ro 501, built in Germany for the Japanese submarine fleet. As a gift to the Germans, I-8 took a cargo of quinine. On July 6th, escorted by the submarine I-10, she left the port of Penang. The first part of the journey through the Indian Ocean was passed without interference. There was no particularly fresh weather, a phenomenon common to these waters. After replenishing fuel from the submarine I-10, the submarine I-8, according to plan, headed independently for the onward journey around the Cape of Good Hope. In order to avoid a possible encounter in this area with enemy anti-submarine defense ships, the boat passed within 300 miles of the Cape, where the band of roaring 40s latitudes is said to extend for more than 1,000 miles. For 10 days the boat struggled against the waves of the raging ocean, unable to develop a sailing speed of more than 5 knots. The upper deck, running bridge and airplane hangar were damaged by the waves. Sailors, tied for safety with lifelines, twice repaired the hangar literally in the jaws of the hurricane. Eventually the boat was able to emerge into a calm area of the ocean and continue its journey into the Bay of Biscay. Rounding the northwest coast of Africa, she was wary of American planes based in the Azores. An encounter with a German submarine occurred at a designated location south of the Azores. Within 4 hours, the German submarine was in the water. The Germans had installed a radar observation station on the I-8, without which the boat was in danger of surprise air attack. The previously installed Japanese radar equipment proved unsuitable. After the personnel from the German submarine completed the radar installation, the submarine I-8 continued its journey, taking a course for Brest. In the Bay of Biscay, following 5 miles off the Spanish coast, it was necessary to remain in an underwater position to avoid unwanted encounters with merchant ships, as well as enemy aircraft that were heavily patrolling the entrance to the bay. The Germans sent an airplane. As she approached Brest, the escort was reinforced with several more planes, and 10 German destroyer squadrons boats cleared the harbour entrance of magnetic mines. On September 5th, the I-8 boat passed through the last passage leading to the submarine shelter. Thus, after a passage of 61 days from Penang, she was under a 6-metre reinforced concrete covering, protected at last from air attack. All repair shops and other facilities in German submarine bases were similarly protected, so that under air attacks of any magnitude, submarines could be repaired and crews rested in complete safety. In contrast, basing conditions in most Japanese naval bases were poor, with every air attack causing great confusion. By mid-September, the I-8 submarine had prepared for the return crossing to Japan. Several hundred tons of cargo that Japan needed had been taken aboard. Even the torpedo tubes were filled with cargo, which included mechanisms and instruments for torpedoes, counter machine guns for airplanes, and ships' watches. The boat left under heavy guard. As a precautionary measure for the period of further solo cruising, the boat's radio communications with the German Naval Command were limited to the following signals. Past position A, which meant past the area of greatest danger. Past position B, which meant crossed the equator. Past position C, which means left the Atlantic Ocean. Position A was passed safely and the first signal was sent. As soon as the boat crossed the equator, the commander again transmitted the conditional signal past position B. The next day an enemy airplane appeared. Probably the radio signal was intercepted, and the boat was pinged. The boat quickly submerged and was able to avoid danger, but the next morning, while in a surface position, it was attacked by an enemy aircraft. This time the boat managed to dive to a depth of 54 meters when the explosions of depth bombs dropped by the plane were heard. The explosions caused a lot of trouble. From one compartment they reported the intake of overboard water. For a moment it seemed that the end was near. It was soon discovered that the water was coming in through a damaged waterline valve. The defect was quickly eliminated. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but the boat remained in an underwater position for the rest of the day. In the strip of roaring 40s latitudes, a wave broke the glass on the bridge. There was no other damage on the way back. During the next 2 days of passage near enemy bases, the boat followed during daylight hours in the underwater position in order not to be detected by the enemy. Thereafter she was able to go over water, although she was exposed to the impact of the waves, but still the wind was not so strong. In the Indian Ocean, sailing was already considered safe. It was possible to attach identification marks. During this work an airplane appeared over the boat and began to dive on it. Fortunately it was not an enemy plane. When the boat entered the Indian Ocean, most of the fuel had already been used up. There was no response to the requests sent to Penang base and the Japanese ships in the Indian Ocean, and the boat continued on her way, using up the rest of the fuel. After passing the Strait of Zondo, she reached Singapore in early December. Thus, the return passage took 64 days. Later, I-8 reached Japan safely. She was the only Japanese submarine to complete the 30,000-mile bilateral voyage. The German passengers who arrived in Japan on this submarine were 3 naval officers, 4 radar and hydroacoustic technicians, 1 German army officer, and 4 civilians. The Germans had thoughtfully delivered rice for us on the boat, grown perhaps in Italy or southern France. At first they took Japanese food with us once a day, but after about 10 days they requested bread. In early April 1943, submarine I-29, having received orders to rendezvous with a German boat in the Indian Ocean, left Penang. Passing the Straits of Mozambique, she met the German boat 400 miles southwest of Madagascar on April 28th. Here she took on board Chandra Bose, a leader of the Indian independence movement, and one of his companions, and after handing over the officer bound for Germany, lay on a return course, arriving at Penang early in May. The successful completion of this passage helped give a boost to the Indian independence movement and made the idea of an Allied offensive in the India area unfeasible. The submarine I-29 was later used in actions to disrupt maritime communications in the Indian Ocean in early November 1943. She left Penang again, this time bound for Germany. Following the same route as the I-30 and I-8 submarines, the boat arrived safely at the west coast of France. On the return trip between Singapore and Japan in the Washi Strait southeast of the island of Formosa, she was torpedoed by an American submarine. The boat's commander, Captain 3rd Rank T. Kinasi, and most of the crew were killed. At about the same time, the submarine I-34 finished preparations in Japan for the campaign to Germany, and then, having taken a cargo of rubber, tin, tungsten and quinine, left Singapore by the Strait of Malacca on November 11th. However, almost within sight of Penang, despite increased surveillance, she was torpedoed and sunk by a British submarine. The submarine Row 501, which had been built in Germany and for which the crew had been brought from Japan, went out under the command of Captain 3rd Rank Norida to Japan. After the boat entered the Atlantic Ocean, communications were lost with her, and as it was later learned, she was sunk in a battle with an American destroyer on May 13, 1944. The last submarine, the I-52. The last submarine that attempted to make the trip fell victim to the Allied forces that had secured the Normandy landings. In early 1945, Japanese engineers X. Tomonaga and M. Shodo, Tomonaga and M. Shoji, who were working in Germany, were ordered to return to Tokyo. It was stipulated that they would go on a German submarine. Captain Third Rank Tomonaga was an outstanding ship designer, and Captain Third Rank Shoji was a first-class aircraft designer. Their services were greatly needed by the Japanese Navy. The details of the boat's passage were coordinated with the German Naval Command. Passengers and cargo had to be transferred to a Japanese submarine in the Indian Ocean. At the end of January 1945, Berlin was subjected to heavy air raids every night. There was no electric lighting, lack of fuel, glass in the windows of most houses were broken, cold, penetrating winds were blowing. By this time, Allied activities against enemy submarines had intensified. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard for German submarines. Thus, the passage of the named officers on a German submarine out to sea was fraught with great danger. The envisioned rendezvous with the Japanese boat did not take place. A few weeks later, American radio broadcast a message from which the fate of the boat and the two Japanese officers became known being on patrol in the Gulf of Mexico. American patrol ship surrendered to the German submarine, which was raised white flag. The commander and crew of the German submarine were taken prisoner and, after landing ashore, taken into custody. American officials who examined the submarine discovered the bodies of two Japanese naval officers in full uniform who had committed suicide by taking poison.